Hey everybody, it's Paul Schulte. We are very happy and pleased to be launching a new podcast for Schulte Research, and we're going to call it Where Eagles Dare. I want you to look at the logo and notice that this is going to be a podcast in the intersection of finance, cybersecurity, and defense security. And notice that all three of these, the symbol in the US is an eagle, and they are nearly identical. And in fact, the eagle from the Department of Defense is the same eagle on the back of the dollar. And the eagle is also on the back, on the symbol of the National Security Agency. The eagle is a sign of imperial rule and was the main symbol of the Roman Empire. And so we are going to be discussing many different topics in the intersection of the new Cold War between the US and China, the way it affects financial markets, and issues about security, in particular cybersecurity, and the ongoing, and I believe intensifying, proxy wars in Hong Kong in particular, but also stretching to other countries around the world. So please stay tuned, and the first one is coming your way in a second. Thanks. Good afternoon, everybody. In this podcast, we will discuss the question of whether the recent national security legislation in Hong Kong will have the desired effect for the authorities, or whether violent protests will continue to escalate and impact society and the economy. Secondly, based on those outcomes, do business operations need to decamp and relocate? And is there a better way to approach business and investments in China, for example, via Shenzhen, Shanghai, or Singapore? Let's do a recap. The new national security law for Hong Kong was just passed, 11 o'clock on Tuesday night. It was lawfully enacted very quickly by the NPC through the Politburo on the 23rd anniversary of the July 1 handover from 1997. This legislation is geared up to put an end to protests in Hong Kong that have become increasingly violent over the past year. The law criminalizes, number one, secession, number two, subversion, number three, terrorism, and number four, collusion with any foreign forces inside Hong Kong. It has also been announced that in special circumstances, the Beijing-led National Security Agency in Hong Kong can send serious cases to the mainland for trial. So today we'll briefly discuss the national security and legal apparatus that is being introduced, and the anticipated effect that this will have on activists and organized protest groups, as well as the narrative that is driving them and wider actors that may be supporting and influencing them. Today we have two fantastic people, Ruben S., who himself has spent many years in Army intelligence and does cybersecurity in both Asia and Europe and the United Kingdom. And also with me is James B., who is a former Special Forces person from an undisclosed location. And I'm so glad to have them here, and I absolutely enjoy talking to Ruben. He's a fountain of knowledge, and James B. is one of the up-and-comers in the thought leadership on counterinsurgency. So take it away. Let's first look at the new structure of the National Security Agency in Hong Kong. It has been formed through the Chief Executive Office of Carrie Lam, reporting directly to her on a sub-cabinet level, appointed by Beijing, and will have a direct line to the national security agencies in Beijing, and offers oversight and influence over the Hong Kong police unit underneath it, separate from the Hong Kong Police Department. This is reflective of the UK special branches, which has separate powers of arrest, intelligence, investigation, and charging for subversion and terrorism. So it's a kind of special branch underneath the PRC. The structure and legal powers are all clearly aimed at counterterror and arresting for sedition. Okay, so James, in the run-up to this national security law, are there parallels to civil disturbance and conflict in Northern Ireland? First question.
Yes, I think there's absolutely some interesting parallels, although it's important to make sure we all understand the historical context here. Northern Ireland's colonial history and indeed its revolutionary history are not necessarily perfect mirrors to what's happening at the moment with Hong Kong and the PRC. Socioeconomics and the historical relationship of Hong Kong with regard to the PRC is quite different to that of Northern Ireland with regard to the UK. However, the overriding parallel of a foreign government trying to operate in a provincial state that's trying to establish its own independence in some way can't be missed. So yes, to a degree, there is definitely a parallel to the UK and Northern Ireland. And I think this is quite important when we start to consider the longer term overarching meta-narratives that feed asymmetric conflicts like this. Whilst the short-term immediate responses to violence, injustice, or oppression might be innate reactions based on instinct, it's important to note that the difference between flashpoints and revolutions, or indeed insurgencies, is often in the narrative. Certainly there's some interesting comparisons could be made between many insurgencies during their infancy, but the way that narrative is shaped around them and the way it's utilized by the individual actors themselves ultimately ends up shaping not only the discourse surrounding the conflict, but also the trajectory of conflict itself. If you look at Iran's Islamic Revolution, for example, and the way it framed itself versus the presentation and perception from the USA and the UK, and how that rhetoric ended up shaping the trajectory of future relations and policy decisions with implications we're still feeling today. We can also look at Latin America during the Cold War and the many student revolutions, or if we look at Daesh or ISIL and their actions in the Middle East. The narrative that they present is kind of the antithesis of the European construct of nationalism and Westphalian statehood. But at the heart of their Anglophone propaganda, they have this really strong message of legitimate statehood. And then on the ground, the reality for many ISIL-aligned fighters is that their allegiance is often defined by fluidity and pragmatism, more so than it is about dogma or some form of cohesive national identity.
Yeah, that's great, fascinating. Ruben, you and I have had a lot of discussion about this over the last year, and you really perked up my ears and opened my eyes to what's going on. What is the relationship between some of these international intelligence agencies fanning the flames in Hong Kong, and why would they be doing that?
Well, firstly, good afternoon, Paul, and thank you for inviting me onto this podcast, and good afternoon to you as well, James. Very interesting question. Are international intelligence agencies fanning the flames? My answer would be yes, it would appear to be so. With Northern Ireland, there was, just to follow on to the previous question, there was perhaps not the international interest and focus that there is in Hong Kong, because arguably there is not the same stake there for international actors. There are some obvious parallels though, and we know that the Provisional IRA received arms and financing from Libya, for example. In Northern Ireland in the early 70s, there was the declaration of the state of emergency under an amended Emergency Powers Act originally in 1926. There was internment without trial. Operation Motorman was a very large-scale military operation in 1972 designed to reclaim no-go areas in the Republican community and to rebuild confidence in policing and law and order and to disrupt terrorist operations. And I think we're seeing some of that being played out. There is a lack of confidence in law and order and the ability for business as usual to operate and thrive. But Northern Ireland was an internal civil conflict initially between two communities, and then later between terrorist groups and the British state. So I personally, I do expect to see more violent resistance develop in Hong Kong, but it's different because Northern Ireland was not perhaps a proxy war between two superpowers using the province of Northern Ireland as a battleground for that. What might be a closer example might be the former Yugoslavia, considering the local warring factions there and the wider international actors there in the early and mid-90s. The Serbs seeking to mobilize or gain military support and influence from Russia, and the Army of the Republic of Bosnia and Herzegovina seeking in parallel and later successfully mobilizing NATO. Of course, international influence and interference here in Hong Kong is going to be much more subtle and much more difficult to spot for most onlookers. I don't think this is over. I do feel it will escalate further, and it may well be that for example, US power and influence is being exercised here.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. And that was your view, you know, right before this started, and you were way out there on a limb, and you've been really right all along, my friend. So how would a counter-terror unit that's just been set up, that's new and inexperienced and fresh and sort of bumbling along, how does it operate in the early stages of an insurrection like Hong Kong?
Well, it's again, it's been really interesting and sometimes difficult to watch. I have to admit, at you know, in my opinion, a real unpreparedness, almost a naivety of the Hong Kong police and how they've been handling this so far. It's also arguable that you know, this act and these powers are coming in many months too late, and that the groundswell of revolt, displeasure with the authorities and the way that's been acted out has already grown to such a critical mass that it will be extremely difficult to put that down and control it. You know, we've seen some early arrests in the last couple of days following protests. Wednesday, we understand that at least 10 arrests were made under that national security law. It's probably a little early to see how the strategy will play out for the security forces. There will be training and talking about strategy and how they're going to work that strategy through. But really what I think it needs to be is classic kind of counterinsurgency, counterinsurrection strategy, which has always been identify, locate, isolate, and negate those that are organizing violent and armed protest. And, you know, let's be very clear, we are looking at armed protest here. A more modern term might be find, fix, and strike. For me, I've always felt that the most important thing for any military or paramilitary group is absolutely critical, is that they have communications and secure communications for them to operate effectively and avoid detection and arrest. So interception of communications would be key for me for intelligence and for disruption of their operational capability. Now, don't forget, we've already seen apartment raids revealing thousands of pounds of chemical explosives, a cache of bomb-making equipment, and at Hong Kong Polytechnic University, the Hong Kong police have found around about 1,200 improvised grenades. We have seen a close quarter assassination attempt has already occurred, and clear there is motivation, there is technical capability for improvised rockets. So for me, intelligence is key, and that will flow through all of this to try and keep pace with, and more importantly, predict what violent groups might do next. Human intelligence predominantly is very important, but we have to expect that what we would call signals intelligence would happen. So that means on the social media side, right through to the more sophisticated communications methods, that they will receive massive penetration technically, I would expect. Most of this should be intelligence based, because we have to remember that whatever the authorities do, the heavier handed their tactics, then the more they will play into the repression narrative.
Yeah, no, that's fascinating. And so will activists and protesters turn into terrorists, or has this happened already? If so, what is the narrative that is driving this? Yeah, so I would say that, you know, the dean of the university at Hong Kong Polytechnic, you know, he was pleading to the camera, and he said, "What have we done? What have we done to turn our youth into producing 1,200 diesel bombs, Molotov cocktails? What are we doing to turn these kids into bomb makers?" And there was an interview with the kid around 20, 21 years old on the street several months ago, and the newscaster asked this guy, look what you're doing, look what you're doing to your own city, you're destroying your future. And the guy looked at her just incredulous and said, "What future? What are you talking about? We don't have any future. That's why we're here." And so that was very sobering, and caused everyone to take a pause in terms of just how desperate the younger population of Hong Kong has felt for many, many years. This has been brewing way before the 5 years ago umbrella revolution that stopped, Central, and you had thousands of people living in the streets, literally living in the streets for 2 months in tents, and they stopped traffic for 2 months, and the government didn't do anything. The government did nothing after that demonstration ended. And so you also have a media campaign which is very effective at looking at Hong Kong as a victim of China's, something China's been doing, which has been taking away their wealth and bringing it to China, when in fact, some of the blame has to fall on the local tycoons living on the peak, who have dominated the economy for decades and have sucked up tens of billions of dollars, and in a few cases of some of the tycoon families, just taking it out of Hong Kong and investing it in other places. And so this has caused Hong Kong to be one of the most unequal places in the world, where a 25 or 27-year-old guy wanting to get married is never going to have a chance to own an apartment. He's never going to get a wife who can accept him because of his wealth and his ability to provide, as a family man. And so what you've got basically is a generation of people who just feel left behind. And I think these levels of stress and anxiety and physical and mental health problems, that's an epidemic among the young community, is just one of the many symptoms of this. So what you have basically is in many cases, China is being blamed wrongly for the inequality, which is caused by tycoons inattentive to mental health, to homelessness, to unemployment, to any sort of public benefits, for public housing, for instance, for better education, technical education in junior colleges, drug addiction, and alcoholism. And so what you have is an overeducated crowd where the wage today is, in nominal terms, the same as it was 15 years ago. The nominal wage for a college graduate is the same now as it was 15 years ago. And property prices have moved up 4x in that period of time. That's the problem in Hong Kong. And so you have a disenfranchised younger population in terms of property, prosperity, the capacity for a future, the capacity to create a family. And essentially they have been cut out and they blame China. So this is another example of another country which is basically looking at itself as a victim and finding a scapegoat to blame them for unequal structures that have been created internally and domestically. And so, and of course, the great point that James has made is that the closeness of Hong Kong and China has not caused a greater sense of communication and community among a native, Han Chinese population. It's only magnified the differences. And so what has China been doing? Slowly, China did the One Connect to connect the stock market. It did immigration centers in West Kowloon to connect the immigration service. And now you have a national security law, which is essentially connecting the law. So you have the financial elements of Hong Kong connected to China. Now you have the immigration elements connected to China, and now you have a law connected directly to China. And so China's slowly taking over, and I think that the alienation is likely to grow deeper. And so I'm kind of with Ruben on this one, that this is going to go deeper. There were a lot of people on Monday who thought that the implementation of the law on Tuesday was going to cause a lot of people to become sheepish and go home on Wednesday. The exact opposite happened. There was constant run-ins all through Central, all the way to Causeway Bay, all day long, with tear gas, rubber bullets, pepper spray, and these hundreds of arrests. And in particular, I believe it was 18 arrests for the national security law. So we have a gross inequality like many other countries in the world, and we're seeing this kind of violence. I think Hong Kong is symptomatic of a much larger problem, where asset prices have moved up and the rich have been able to enjoy those asset prices, that asset price appreciation, and the other part of the economy the billions of people who don't have access to credit, don't have any access to physical assets that grow with this kind of central bank-led inflation are completely left out. And there is a growing displeasure. And as Ray Dalio puts it, when the inequality grows, people start fighting. And James, what's your view? You have this fascinating view from all over the world, from Africa and from Latin America, and from your activity in special forces. So what's your thinking?
Well, I think you've kind of hit the nail on the head there. It's a pretty great summary. Whenever we have large amounts of inequality, we tend to see crime, and we tend to see violent crime follow that. But let's not forget about COVID-19. I mean, if you want to talk about an October surprise, global pandemic's a pretty big factor. So when you already have this sense of economic insecurity, and then a pandemic comes in on top of a disenfranchised society, you have a recipe for violent protests that can lead very quickly and very easily towards conflict, armed struggle, and terrorism. Historically, pandemics lead to revolutionary conflict. If you consider the Black Death in England, all the economic issues following that, which ultimately led to the Peasants' Revolt. And then not all that long after, you have the Spanish flu and all of the insecurity that followed in Europe after that. Human beings have not actually changed that much. For all that our societies have developed and grown with global reach, the base function of a human, the base function of our societies is that when these kinds of occurrences arise, the rich people survive and the poor people will be disproportionately affected. And when that happens, it only serves to compound the issue of a growing chasm. And in Hong Kong, what we're seeing is this growing chasm between a highly educated, socially paralyzed youth who identify more and more with Hong Kong, and then the CCP loyalists who wish to see greater Chinese control over Hong Kong.
Yeah, fascinating. And then, so James, what are the basic crime fighting tools for counterterrorism in a low intensity, they say LIC, low intensity conflict, low intensity insurrection? Intelligence and infiltration, psychological operations to convince people to stop fighting, the hearts and minds. What are we talking about here?
Well, certainly, as Ruben touched on earlier, intelligence is going to be absolutely key in managing the spread of any insurrection. And with that kind of human intelligence approach, you certainly want to see a large degree of infiltration, as well as the SIGINT that Ruben was touching on earlier. But I think what's kind of interesting here is the intersection that we see between terrorism and then the other elements of criminality in society, particularly when you start to look at political and economic disenfranchisement. With terrorism or with any other form of violent crime, you really do expect to see particularly young, poor, and disillusioned males engaged in those activities. And I would suggest that any focus for traditional law enforcement would provide a good basis for the intelligence networks that are going to be required to fight against an insurrection or some kind of revolutionary struggle. I would suggest that whether you're talking about Africa, whether you're talking about the Middle East, whether you're talking about Hong Kong, the fundamental ingredients for a successful counterinsurgency or counter-terror approach are by and large the same, but they need to be measured in different quantities to taste. What we've seen in recent years, and the use of social media, the use of the internet and communications to divide and conquer, as well as to unify along different fault lines. A modern approach to these kinds of insurgency issues would likely place a large emphasis on communications and psyops, big data from social media, as well as a constant stream of good, robust human intelligence to provide, find, and fix capabilities, which would then be acted upon with strike operations by more specialist units to disrupt the cell nexus.
Yeah, wow. Ruben, what is the process for young insurrectionists to stop making mistakes with leaking info, et cetera, to become a cohesive? That's a tough one. Yeah.
Yeah, well, thank you, Paul. Before I answer that, let me just say that I am not in any way advocating or advising such groups on how to proceed. This is a commentary on, based on my past experience as to what happens. And it's interesting to think about. Again, I'm going to go back to the IRA, the provisional IRA. Remember, there was a split between the official IRA and the provisional IRA, what became the predominant military wing. And if you look at a period when 1968-69, with thousands on the streets in the Northern Ireland Civil Rights Association, the NICRA movement, how do you get from thousands of people on the street protesting with banners, demanding rights and equality, and housing and prosperity and all of the things that you talked about, Paul? How do you go from thousands of people doing that to a 4-person, men and women, 4-person, dedicated, autonomous active service unit within the provisional wing of the IRA? What is the process that happens there? And what happens there is a question around selection. There is a question around trust within the organization. There is a question about capability, confidence, and commitment of individuals within this populace that is protesting. There will be a smaller, hardcore group of individuals that wish to continue the struggle in an armed way, working with autonomy and mounting attacks against the security forces. I would expect that to happen. We might call it the more revolutionary wing or the more ardent elements. And what they're going to do is they're going to look and watch and observe. Remember the terrorist mantra. The terrorist group's mantra is, we only have to be lucky once, you have to be lucky all the time. In relation to the forces that are trying to police and contain this are already at a disadvantage to the smaller groups that can act with surprise, with autonomy, with developed tactics. They have the upper hand, in my opinion. They can observe, they can watch how security forces respond to incidents and capitalize on that. I think we've already seen, and considering the scale of the protests and the amount of people that are involved, we've already seen superb coordination and communications. So my question for your listeners is potentially, how much better can that be when it's a smaller group that you need to organize and mobilize? So I think it becomes easier as those groups tighten and condense into smaller, harder core factions. And again, this is what the provisional IRA did. They become more difficult to penetrate, essentially. We saw the same with Al-Qaeda more recently. And if these groups can organize and arm, maintain secure communications and autonomy, then we may well be in for a much longer period of unrest and instability here, not to mention, of course, casualties on all sides.
Yeah, fascinating. James, anything you want to add?
Well, I think Ruben has kind of nailed it there. It's very much a question of maturing processes and developing a more robust structure in response to the actions of the security forces. As we saw with Al-Qaeda, we see this breaking into cellular structures that become very difficult to penetrate and operate with a high degree of autonomy. So no one cell knows all of the information. It becomes incredibly difficult then for your intelligence services to build a complete picture of what's happening. And that goes kind of beyond just structures and how to thwart the efforts of the intelligence community, but moving forwards to direct responses to the security forces and the police. There will be different tactics that will start to grow in prevalence in response to the tactics and strategies implemented by the security forces. For example, in Afghanistan, the IED became ubiquitous because it became a remarkably successful and effective weapon against coalition forces with very low risk to those who were setting them. Or in fact, even the use of vehicles now as weapons in domestic terror attacks across Europe and across the global north. It's a development of a new tactic, which is incredibly difficult to predict, incredibly difficult to anticipate, and it can be implemented with very low cost and very high speed. So I think that while it's difficult to say exactly what new tactics we should expect to appear, certainly they will be developed as kind of a conversation between the security forces and between these groups. And they will both be responding to each other as they try to develop new techniques to prevent each other. Before we move on, I would just like to say that terrorism is often used as a communicative act. And when we look at the tactics being employed by the groups in Hong Kong, what we see is that for many, as you were kind of touching on earlier, Paul, they don't see any other alternative. They don't see that their life necessarily is heading anywhere. They don't have social mobility or an upwards economic trajectory. The use of near suicidal assassination attempts, as Ruben was touching on earlier, and then the absence of escape plans is very telling. It's simultaneously a call to action for allies in the face of an overwhelmingly powerful and brutish enemy, whilst it's also being framed as kind of a stark warning to that enemy that, hey, I'm not to be pushed around. I'm already in a corner and you don't know what I'm going to do next. That unpredictability and really communicating the violence of action and that unpredictability to the enemy. That's what they're going to be going for, I think.
Yeah, no, it's chilling, and I think you're right on the money. Now, James, one of the fascinating points you bring up is the will and the mindset of these people to carry on. What's your experience in the past of how to detect sort of the will to carry on and the mindset to intensify opposition to a very powerful new policing unit?
Sure. So I really don't think that we've seen the last of these protesters or terrorists, as the CCP would label them. The reason for that is that I think they have this mindset now, or this kind of strategic identity that they've built around their position, and they're becoming entrenched in it. As you said earlier, Paul, this is something that's been building for a very long time. This isn't a one-off flashpoint. People are upset and then they'll move on. This is something that we've seen growing essentially since the handover. We've seen this progression as China and Hong Kong have sought to move closer together. The attitudes of those in Hong Kong towards China have actually started to veer off away, and they've built this identity based on not on their similarities but actually on their differences to the mainland. And I think the question when we wonder how this is going to go and how this is going to look moving forwards is not, okay, are they going to fizzle out as protesters did post Tiananmen Square? I think that what we can expect to see is actually an intensification, an intensifying of the efforts of the protesters or militant groups, however you'd like to define them. And it'll be interesting to see moving forwards whether that will is strong enough and whether that mindset is unified and cohesive enough to form these little cellular structures that will be able to operate independently of each other, potentially independent of a clearly unified leadership, driving themselves forward. I think the point that you made earlier, talking about that interviewee who very poignantly said, we don't have a future. I think that sums it all up right there. These guys don't see that they have any alternative, they have nothing to lose, and they potentially have everything to gain by pushing forwards.
Yeah, and the thing that was so chilling about that interview was the guy looked at the interviewer like, don't you see what we're trying to achieve here? Don't you see that we are so desperate that it's obvious we don't have a future? How can you not see this? He was dumbfounded that people are so like delusional that they could not even see the displeasure and the unhappiness and the sense of hopelessness among these people, and why they would actually try to throw away their futures when clearly they don't have one. We want to wrap up. I'm going to ask a couple of questions. So Ruben and James, both to you. So today it was disclosed in a public article. There's no intel here that there was a $2 million amount of money set aside through U.S. intelligence agencies to provide communication, secure communication, quote unquote, to the protesters from the U.S. government, and that was disclosed today. So, Ruben, what's your take on that?
Well, firstly, if I ask the question, is this a realistic, is this a realistic possibility that this kind of activity could happen? Yes, based on precedent. There are many conflicts where we've seen, powerful countries assisting smaller minority groups, and we probably don't have time to list the examples of where that's happened, whether that's economic influence, whether it's actually high-grade military weapons, whether it's a technical capability. We've seen it before. I think it's really important to point out that because I'm talking about my cybersecurity perspective on this, that offensive cyber operations for me would be where a lot of the effort would be. It's passive to a degree. It doesn't mean you have to put thousands of police necessarily on the street. So it can be covert and passive, and it can be extremely rewarding in terms of the intel that they may get back. Now, it would be interesting to think about where if let's say PRC, we know have a great capability there, and it would be naive to think that is not being exercised right now. If another nation state wanted to assist those protesting and fighting for what they believe in, this would be very helpful, probably a very helpful and welcome addition to their arsenal, to have some kind of assistance there on technical communication security and cyber, I would have thought.
That's fascinating. James, what's your thinking?
Absolutely. I think, cyber isn't my background. And so I won't touch on that too much. There's nothing that I could add there that Ruben hasn't already covered really eloquently. But I think as far as this question of interference from foreign powers and whether we can expect to see more or less of that, I think that we are entering into a new kind of proxy conflict. And I don't think that it's the only one. I think it might be the only one that people are paying any attention to, but there are certainly other proxies going on in this new kind of Cold War that's developing.
Between the US and China.
Yes, precisely, between the US and China. And that's no secret. Going back to Obama, there was a very public policy shift away from the Middle East and over towards the Pacific. It's not something that's been hidden away under the table. We're not. We're talking about open source intelligence here. This is published. This is documented. And we see in other parts of the world where China has a degree of hegemony, if not full kind of colonial or imperial ties, across Africa, for example. So you have Angola, you have Mozambique, you have Namibia, you have Zambia, all of these countries where China has large immigration projects and large infrastructure development projects. And we're starting to see little cracks appearing in different places. Notably in Mozambique, it's not getting all that much attention at the moment in the press, but there's a straight up insurgency being fought in the north of that country. A lot of interesting things are going on, but certainly the government is very closely allied to China and historically always has been. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out as more information starts to come out. But certainly if I was president of the United States and I wanted to create problems for China, this is how I would do it. You create this struggle on their own doorstep, very similar to the old Cold War mentality of, you didn't strike the heart of Moscow, you would dig away at Chechnya and the little pockets of resistance. That's what you would try to build and cement. And you would create this image of an evil empire that was doing everything that it could to stamp out individuality, to stamp out freedom, and to oppress. And I think this is playing very neatly towards China's playbook, which is to stamp out acts of sedition, acts of subversion. And we're seeing that now. They seem to be playing this like a book. So I don't think that we've seen the end of this, and I suspect there will be more developments about the involvement of foreign powers moving forwards.
Yeah, I agree. I think we're in a new non-aligned movement. You know, the non-aligned movement of the 1960s was founded by Sukarno in Jakarta with a lot of help from China, and that was spread to Latin America, Africa, Middle East, and now the new non-aligned movement comes out of Beijing. And the question and the joke when I was working in the National Security Council in the 80s was, yeah, non-aligned with whom? And so this is the question that a lot of countries are going to have to answer, especially like Singapore. The last comment I would say, you guys, I'd like to hear your thoughts. I was reflecting last night, you know, why did China do this? Why did China spend a huge amount of its national attention span was spent on this law, all the way up to the top of the government, you know, essentially to the top of the equivalent of the Supreme Court, the Senate, you know, a bipartisan agreement in the House, agreement with the Supreme Court, and then agreement with the executive office on something like this national security law. They are doing this because they know something very, very seriously wrong is occurring in Hong Kong, which is very dangerous to China's well-being. That is why they did this, right? You know, Ruben, do you agree?
I do agree, but firstly, I think money is no object. You know, when it comes to, you know, the highest levels of strategy and decision making for China, money is no object. They're an extremely wealthy and powerful state, and I don't know what fraction of their budget goes on national security, you know, in total, but this just would not be a consideration. The other thing I might say is their timing is always interesting, if not impeccable. Whilst the rest of the world has been focusing on COVID and been in lockdown and moving into recession in a lot of countries, there has obviously been time for them to prepare this. For me, as I said earlier, this is at least 6 months too late, if not 9 months too late, you know, speaking from China's perspective. But they've caught up with themselves during the last 3 months of COVID, and it's not just launched on the anniversary, you know, of independence, but it's launched at a time when people are freely moving about back on the streets, and that's their concern, is that they will, you know, Hong Kong post lockdown is the playground for the protester again, and violent protests. So I think their timing is, it's late, but the more recent timing is probably just right from how they see it. I don't see, you know, the financing and implementation of this is being seen by them at all to be costly. I think it's extremely necessary. It does indicate, as you say, their intention, but it will be interesting to see whether it has the desired effect. We look forward to seeing what happens over the next weeks and months. Yeah,
that's fascinating. James, how about you?
Well, I think for China, this is likely going to become a matter of pride. If you think of China as a large, powerful empire, which historically they have been, it's very difficult for an empire to consider losing a possession, especially not one that they had to kind of struggle to get a hold of. They haven't had Hong Kong for all that long. They're slowly moving towards, you know, away from the one nation two systems approach towards full unification, and this speed bump along the way is certainly going to be a point of embarrassment, and that's not something that I think the Chinese will suffer lightly. I suspect that what we've seen as far as their commitment is only going to grow from here. As the protesters or militant groups will escalate, so too will the security forces. I mean, President Xi Jinping has been really clear on this point, talking about how they would kind of crush any resistance. I forget the exact quote that he used. It was something particularly emotive about grinding bones to dust or something. He's had some very strong language about this, and I suspect that we'll only see the Chinese efforts intensify in the coming months. Okay, great. James and Ruben, we got to call it quits. I would just highlight in 30 seconds, we have 1841 was the first Opium War, started in Hong Kong. 1840, Second Opium War, started in Hong Kong. 1860, the Taiping Rebellion, and 30 million people died, started in Hong Kong. 1920, the fall of the imperial dynasty, Sun Yat-sen, started in Hong Kong. Hong Kong scares Beijing, and they are going to put a stop to this in exactly the language that James mentioned. Ruben, thank you. You're a great interlocutor. I can't tell you. You're such a great friend and a great interlocutor. You're a fascinating guy. And James, you are one of the up-and-coming wunderkind of all of this intellectual, heavyweight content on counterinsurgency. And so thank you so much for your time, and we look forward to doing this again. Thank you. Thanks very much for having me on, Paul, and great to speak with you as well, James. Yeah, likewise. Thanks for having me, and it's been an absolute pleasure.